This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today I'm wrapping up the card-by-card portion of my Streets of New Capenna limited set review. Throughout the week, we've looked at all of the non-green and non-colorless cards, and today we're taking a look at what's left, which is, obviously, green and colorless cards. There will be more Streets of New Capenna limited content on its way, though, including an archetype guide, my picks for the best commons and uncommons, and even draft videos in the not-too-distant future. So keep in mind in this video, I'm only giving my predictions for how good I think these cards will be in the limited formats. That means I'm not talking about any other ways to play Magic, just draft and sealed. That also means we're only talking about cards that appear in draft boosters. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, so if you're new to my set reviews and aren't sure what the grades mean, you should find an explanation in the description. Also, because I wanted to get this whole series up before pre-releases and before the set is on Magic Arena, I haven't actually played with most of these cards, and I'm definitely going to be wrong about some of them. As we start playing the format, I'll give updates on my thoughts in my Nitsa Notes series, which comes out every Saturday. Alright, let's take a look at our first green card in Streets of New Capenna. First up, it's Attended Socialite, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/1 Elf Druid at common. It's got Alliance, so whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Alliance is a mechanic in this set that just does something when a creature enters the battlefield under your control. In this case, we get that +1/+1 bonus. So this looks fine, but unexciting. It's a decent 2-drop for creature-heavy green decks. It will often attack as a 3/2 and sometimes as a 4/2. None of that is absolutely incredible, but it does mean you can do a little bit more damage in the early game. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Bootleggers Stash, which for 5 generic and a green is a mythic rare artifact, and it says lands you control have tapped, create a treasure token. This can generate an absurd amount of mana in a hurry, but the question becomes, do you really need that much mana by the time you can play this in your typical game of Limited? And the answer usually is probably not. The fact it won't do anything the turn you play it in most cases is a pretty big liability too. If you have enough treasure synergies and you're interested in splashing stuff, or just playing a lot of colors, this could be a powerhouse, but that situation won't come up often enough for this to work in any deck. It won't even consistently work in the red-green treasure deck, I don't think. So this does need a build-around grade. It's probably pretty much a D, and maybe worse in your typical deck in the format. Like, if you're desperate for fixing, you have some big expensive bomb, maybe you play it, and it's going to be bad when you don't have your bomb, but it does help you there. But in a deck with a bunch of treasure synergies, and I'm talking like full of them, it gets better than that because you have places to sink your mana, you have ways to turn treasure into value, and I think in a deck like that, it's a B. Next up, it's Bouncer's Beatdown, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon instant, and it says this spell costs 2 less to cast if it targets a black permanent, and it deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. This is premium removal, even if you aren't targeting a black permanent. Sure, you need to have a creature with enough power to make it do its thing, but that's never a huge hurdle for green decks in Limited. When you only pay 1 green for this, it'll feel especially absurd. I think paying 3 for it is like a B-, paying 1 green is like a B+, so if we split the difference there, I think we can say this is a B. Next up, it's Broken Wings, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. So, see this card a lot. It will have enough targets that main decking it isn't a complete disaster, but you do cut it more than you play it. It's definitely a better thing to have out of your sideboard, but it is better in your main deck than a lot of sideboard cards are. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Cabaretti Initiate, which for 1 green is a 1/2 Raccoon Citizen at common, and for 2 generic and a red-green hybrid mana, it gains double strike until end of turn. So, if you can put counters on this, it can get really interesting, and you certainly have access to some of those in this format, but a 1-mana 1/2 gets outclassed very quickly, and giving a creature that size double strike isn't exactly a big deal. You'll play it, of course, in aggressive decks, especially if you have ways to raise its power, but you're also going to cut this from a lot of green decks too. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Kaldaia Strong Arm, which for 4 generic and a green is a 2/3 human warrior at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. And it comes with Blitz for 3 generic and a green. This is the first time we've seen this mechanic in this particular video, so I'll read the reminder text for you. It says, if you cast this spell for its Blitz cost, it gains haste, and when this creature dies, draw a card. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. This is a nice common. Cast a normal way, it can give you a 5 mana 4/5 at worst, and that's not very good, but as a fail case, it's not terrible. You can, of course, put the counters on another creature, and that's usually the way to go, because it gives you a way to add some significant damage to the board immediately. And if adding as much damage to the board as quickly as possible is your thing, you can blitz this, which lets you add 4 or 5 worth of stats to the board for only 4 mana, and then you get to draw a card to replace it. You'll often be able to get close to a card of value out of it when you do blitz, so that's not a bad deal, especially because it makes sure to leave something on the board even once it dies. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Kapena Express, which for 3 generic and a green is a 6/6 vehicle at common. It has crew 3, but you can also sacrifice a treasure for it to become an artifact creature until end of turn. A 4 mana 6/6 vehicle with crew 3 is generally not something to be excited about. That's like a D. But the upside of crewing this with treasure is pretty real, as green and especially red-green looks like it has lots of ways to make treasure. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Civic Gardener, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 human citizen at common, and whenever it attacks, you untap target creature or land. This type of attack trigger is not especially impactful. Sure, it sort of has vigilance, and it can lend it to other creatures in a way, and it can even help you have mana in your second main phase, but all those things end up being really minor or pointless more often than they're useful. It's definitely a fine 2-drop, but there are a lot of better ones around too. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Cleanup Crew, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/6 human citizen at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose one. You can destroy an artifact, you can destroy an enchantment, you can exile a card from a graveyard, or you can gain 4 life. So, I love modal cards in Limited, and this is a sweet one. You'll always be able to get something pretty nice out of it. At worst, you basically have Honey Mammoth, in other words, a 6 mana 6/6 that gains you 4 life. And that kind of creature is usually great top curve in mini decks. We've seen them in lots of formats lately. But then it comes with options like naturalizing something or hating on the graveyard. You'll feel the best when you play this when you get to just blow up an enchantment or artifact because you're getting a 2-for-1, subtracting from their board while you add a 6/6 to yours. But the fail case is Honey Mammoth, and that's a great floor. So yeah, I mean, this is a reasonably efficient creature that has a whole lot of utility. I like it a lot. I think you can first pick it in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Courier's Briefcase, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon artifact treasure. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token, and you can tap it and sacrifice it to add 1 mana of any color, and you can pay white, blue, black, red, and green and sack it to draw 3 cards. So at worst, this is 2 mana for a 1/1 and a treasure, and that's kind of an okay deal, and that's sort of the baseline here. The creature it makes is also a citizen, and it also, having something that makes a creature that's not a creature also triggers Alliance, so there's a lot of little synergies here. I do think it needs a build around. I mean, I think you can get away with playing it in just about any green deck. It's probably like a C-, but in the red-green deck, where you're going to be the best and then, better than any deck at making treasure, actually drawing 3 cards with it is a possibility, and the fact that you have a card that is treasure also gives you some extra value. So I think it goes all the way up to a B- in a deck that's really good at making treasure, because if you can consistently also draw 3 cards off of this, it's going to be pretty bonkers. And honestly, doesn't look like it's going to be that hard for that deck to do it. It's not going to be a walk in the park, but it's going to be something you see happen pretty regularly in this format. Next up, it's Elegant Entourage, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/4 elf druid at uncommon. Its alliance trigger is that a creature other than it gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. So this starts out as a 4 mana 4/4, good starting point. Then it has a nice alliance trigger. Giving +1/+1 and trample to something is really going to improve your attacks on a lot of turns. It's a bit of a bummer that it can't target itself. It would be like incredible if it did, like one of the best uncommons in the set. But because it can't target itself, it's, not quite as good. Because not only do you need to play something to get the trigger to happen, you also need to have something that's already in play that's not the Entourage that can benefit from the trigger. And that's just not always going to line up. It sounds like I'm really saying I don't like this card, but in the end, it is a very good card and one of the better uncommons, even if it's not like, one of the best uncommons. So I think I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Evolving Door, which for 2 generic and a green is a rare artifact. You can pay 1, tap it, and sack a creature, and count the colors of the sacrificed creature. Then search your library for a creature card that's exactly that many colors +1. Exile that card, then shuffle. You may cast the exiled card, activate only as a sorcery. This is interesting, but my feeling is that it's probably not good in Limited. You have to sacrifice a creature, and then also have the mana to play whatever you search up, and that's doable. but you're basically giving something up on the board and paying 1 extra mana for some creature that's in your deck. There will also be times where the color of your creatures just doesn't line up the right way to get you what you want. You know, sacrificing a monocolored creature to get a 2-colored creature or a 2-colored creature to get a 3-colored creature seems like you could do it, but the question is whether it's really worth going through all of this to make that happen. Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably just an F. Next up, it's Fight Rigging, which for 2 generic and a green is a rare enchantment with Hideaway 5. When it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, exile 1, and then put the rest on the bottom in a random order. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then, if you control a creature with power 7 or greater, you can play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. I think for limited, this is the best card in this cycle. An enchantment that gives you a counter every turn is something we've seen a lot of, and it's always pretty good. I mean, it really enhances your board in a very real way, and it's great that it does it at the beginning of combat. That means the turn you play it, you can already put a counter on something. And in addition to maybe just having the best of these effects in a vacuum, it also is probably going to be the one where it's the easiest to get the hideaway card out from under it. You know, it's not going to be something you always do, but there are plenty of large creatures in green that really don't need that much help to get to power 7 or greater. So this looks really good to me. I do think it falls a little short of being a bomb, but it's pretty close. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's For the Family, which for 1 green is a common instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and if you control 4 or more creatures, that creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn. 1 mana for +2/+2 is always a solid card. Like, 1 mana tricks are always sort of overperformers just because they can do so much for so little mana in terms of tempo. And yeah, I'd be happier if this just gave the creature trample, but instead of giving it trample, we have this big upside where it can give +4/+4, which is just a crazy boost for 1 mana. Enough of one that any creature pretty much is going to win combat. Enough of one that you can just sneak in lethal. Enough of one that using it on a trample creature is a beating. So, you know, in a go-wide deck, which generally means the Cabaretti or maybe a green-white deck, in those decks, this is going to be the trick that you're pretty interested in. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Freelance Muscle, which for 4 generic and a green is a 4/4 Rhino Warrior at uncommon, and when it attacks or blocks, it gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the greatest power and or toughness among other creatures you control. So, on any board state except when he's all alone, he's going to get some amount of a stats boost. And it's usually going to be enough that having paid 5 mana for this will feel pretty good, and it's nice that it can sort of immediately take advantage of that, even if it can't attack right away. You do get to pass your opponent's turn, and suddenly you have a pretty imposing blocker, again, on pretty much any board. Like, even if it's just getting +2/+2, like, that's a pretty real blocker on most boards. And there are going to be times where it's absolutely massive. Now, he is sort of an awkward cost. 5 mana for a 4/4 doesn't feel great, even though, you know, he's basically not a 4/4 in most situations that matter. But there also will be times where he's alone, and he doesn't really get the boost, and he doesn't have any evasion or anything. So he's not anything incredible, but I do think he is a pretty good uncommon. I'm giving him a C+. Next up, it's Gala Greeters, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 Elf Druid at rare. Its Alliance trigger gives you 3 options, and you have to choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. And the options are put a +1/+1 counter on Gala Greeters, create a tap treasure token, or you gain 2 life. So this is great. If you play this on turn 2 and your opponent never deals with it, I mean, that means they lose. All 3 options it gives you can be good in the right situation, and the modality they have is great, especially because if you play something that makes tokens, you can get more than one effect. There are going to be times where you wish you could just go for the counter every time, but getting the other value is nice too. The treasure can really help you ramp in the early game. This creature can rapidly get quite large, and it can help you stabilize by gaining you life. It gets about as close as you can get to being a bomb for a card that starts out as a 2 mana 1/1, but the fact that it does start out as that 2 mana 1/1 means it's incredibly fragile. And sure, your opponent has to answer it, but almost every removal spell in the format can answer it over the first couple of turns it's out, so it's not exactly difficult to deal with. But again, it gets about as close to being a bomb as you can get given how small this is, and I think that means it's a B+. Next up, it's Glitter Monger, which for 3 generic and a green is a 1/4 Elf Rogue at common, and you can tap it to make a treasure token. So this is a fine source of fixing and mana, especially if you're in a deck that has treasure payoffs. The base stats aren't especially good, though. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's High Rise Sawjack, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 Elf Citizen at common. It's got reach, and when it blocks a creature with flying, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So we've seen this card in spider form before, and it was perfectly solid. It has okay stats and a decent keyword, and 4 power is enough to take down most flyers, and it's a nice thing to trade for those types of creatures. This is a C. Next up, it's Jewel Thief, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 cat rogue at common with vigilance and trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a treasure token. So this is a great common. A 3-mana 3/3 with vigilance and trample is probably knocking on the door of B- already, and adding treasure to the mix is a big deal. Not only does it ramp and fix for you, but as we've seen and as I've said, there's also treasure synergy throughout the set. This is a common you'll first pick pretty regularly. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Luxurious Libation, which for X and a green is an uncommon instant, and it says target creature gets +X/+X until end of turn. Create a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token. So this looks like a solid trick. The bonus it gives will never be that efficient, but the fact it scales definitely matters, and getting a token is some added value, especially if you have some alliance going on, which will sort of magnify what this trick does. Now, it is still a trick, and has all the risks they always have. It's situational and risky. You really can't pump a bunch of mana into this and cross your fingers when your opponent has like 4 cards in hand and all their mana up. If you do that, you're going to get completely blown out, and, that makes it kind of hard to use. It is also sort of nice. You can just pay 1 to make a 1/1 token at instant speed in a pinch, so it has some flexibility. I like it as far as tricks go, but it's still a trick, and it's hard to go over C with most of those. Next up, it's Most Wanted, which for 2 generic and a green is a common enchantment aura with flash and enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+1, and when it dies, you get 2 treasure tokens. So flash auras can be pretty nice. They're sort of like combat tricks that leave some permanent value behind, but only giving +1 to toughness for this cost does mean that it's not going to save your creature as often as you'd probably like. You do get 2 treasure when the creature dies, and that definitely matters. It softens the blow, but there's going to be plenty of situations, like especially in the later game, where you don't have anything to do with that treasure, and, that's kind of a bummer. And it still has all the risks auras have. You can get 2 for 1 in response, etc. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Prize Fight, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. Create a treasure token. Cards that just fight and don't offer a stats boost of any kind tend to be pretty medium. Buffing the creature makes it so that a wider variety of creatures can do something useful with them, and you don't get that here exactly. It does combo interestingly with shield tokens, since it can enable you to fight with a shielded creature without losing it, and that does kind of expand the range of creatures that can fight with this card, kill something, and survive. The treasure is also a pretty nice thing to get back. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Rox Pummeler, which for 5 generic and a green is a 6/3 Rhino Soldier at common. It enters the battlefield with a shield counter. This is the first time we've actually seen this mechanic in this video, and it says, if it would be dealt damage or destroyed, remove a shield counter from it instead, and it has trample as long as it has a shield counter. So the counter is pretty nice on a creature with high power and trample, as it can really put your opponent in a bind when it comes to blocking it. For some of these shield creatures, you can just throw a token in front of it and get the shield to go away, and you can still do that here, but you're probably taking 5 in the process. This seems like a card you really want one of in most of your green decks that aren't super aggressive. Going beyond that is probably a little suspect since it's a 6-drop, but I like valuing the first copy at a C+. Next up, it's Riveteers Decoy, which for 1 generic and a green is a 3/1 human warrior at uncommon. It must be blocked if able, and it has Blitz for 3 generic and a green. A 2-mana 3/1 with decent upside is basically always playable, and this has some nice upside. First, it has to be blocked, which means it can create problems for your opponent in combat. Second, it has Blitz, which means it can come out of nowhere and force your opponent to block it instead of something they want to block more. And sometimes, it'll feel a little bit like a removal spell on the right kind of board where you really want to kill your opponent's X3. Most of the time, it's just going to make your attack better by blitzing into play, and you're not going to get like insane value out of it, but it looks like a nice card. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Social Climber, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 human druid at common. Its alliance trigger gains you 1 life. This has okay stats and a decent alliance trigger. Gaining a bit of life here and there can add up sometimes, and that's especially true when you're making tokens and stuff. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Take to the Streets, which for 4 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. It says creatures you control get +2/+2 until end of turn. Citizens you control get an additional +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. This looks like a nice payoff for going wide, which is the Cabaretti theme in general. And the Cabaretti have a lot of citizens within them, and there's also a green-white citizen deck you'll end up in sometimes. And in both of those decks, this is going to be a nice thing that you pretty much always want one of because it can really finish the game for you. It is, of course, super situational. It basically does nothing until you've gone wide enough, but the vigilance upside on citizens and stuff like that really matters. That can allow you to use this in a situation where maybe it doesn't do lethal, but it allows you to do a bunch of damage and also keep some blockers back, which can win you the game in a couple of turns instead of immediately. I feel like if you want this, it's really not going to be that hard for you to get unless a bunch of other people are drafting the deck at your table, and if that's true, your deck's not going to be very good anyway, but this is just a very niche card for the format, so I think you can value it as a C. It's probably a little more like a C+ in a deck that really gets there. Next up, it's Titan of Industry, which for 4 generic and 3 green is a 7/7 elemental at Mythic Rare with Reach and Trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose 2. You can destroy an artifact or enchantment. You can have target player gain 5 life. You can create a 4/4 green Rhino Warrior creature token, or you can put a shield counter on a creature you control. This is amazing value. Whichever 2 things you choose, you're getting a great deal, since you have a 7 mana 7/7 with Reach and Trample, and 2 Enter the Battlefield abilities to choose from. Making the 4/4 and putting a shield counter on the Titan feels like it's probably the best option most of the time, and that's pretty awesome because your 7/7 with Reach and Trample having a shield counter means it's going to be very difficult to take down. And then you also add a very relevant body to the table. So yeah, this costs 7, that's kind of expensive, but it gives you what a 7-drop should give you, a card that swings the game wildly in your favor, plus with treasure around, it's going to be easier to ramp into this than it might look. This is a bomb, I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Topiary Stomper, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 plant dinosaur at rare with vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. It can't attack or block unless you control 7 or more lands. So this is a 3 mana rampant growth that adds to the board, sort of, because it can't attack or block until you get that 7th land. There will be times where this just really feels like you're casting a 3 mana rampant growth, sorcery and all. Even with the Stomper's help, you're not guaranteed to hit 7 lands in a timely manner, and that is a problem. Still, it is pretty nice fixing in ramp, and it's nice that it has the upside of eventually becoming a creature, basically. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Venom Connoisseur, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 human druid. At uncommon, it has Alliance, and it gains Death Touch, and if it triggers twice in a turn, it also gives Death Touch to all of your creatures. So this will be a 2 mana 2/2 with Death Touch a lot, though not usually on your opponent's turn. It's not impossible to get it on your opponent's turn, but it is harder. And that's a bit of a bummer because having a Death Touch creature is useful both ways, blocking or attacking. Giving the whole board Death Touch isn't out of the question. There's lots of cards that make more than one body. So, that's going to happen. But you still sort of need the right kind of board for that to matter too. So it's not really like a game-breaking effect, but it's some nice value to have on a bear. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Vivian on the Hunt, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a legendary planeswalker Vivian at Mythic Rare. She starts with 4 loyalty. Her +2 says, you may sacrifice a creature. If you do, search your library for a creature with mana value equal to 1, plus the sacrificed creature's mana value, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. She has a +1 that says mill 5 cards, then put any number of creature cards milled this way into your hand, and she has a -1 that creates a 4/4 green Rhino Warrior creature token. She looks great. She can protect herself by using her -1 to generate large tokens, and her +2 and +1 abilities give you nice effects. The +2 can help you birthing pod creatures into play to replace them with something better, and her +1 will often draw you a few cards. So, yeah, she protects herself and she draws you cards, and if a planeswalker can do both of those things, it's usually a bomb in limited, and I think that's the case here. I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Voice of the Vermin, which for 3 generic and a green is a 2/2 human citizen at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, it does so with a shield counter, and when it attacks, target creature you control has base power and toughness 4/4 until end of turn. Before we get to actually talking about this card, I want to say that I love the flavor here and kind of hate it at the same time. I love the idea that this guy uses magic to make his rat friends gigantic. If you don't know, we have pet rats, but it's also kind of a bother to me that we don't get a rat token out of this card. All that aside, all that stuff that doesn't matter aside, this is a pretty good card. The stat line is kind of ugly at first glance, like on mini cards with shield counters, but I think that's because these counters are really good. And its stats aren't as bad as they look at first because when it attacks, it can make itself into a 4/4, and a 4/4 with a shield counter for 4 is pretty nasty. Obviously, making another creature into a 4/4 is an option too. This looks like a pretty good card, even if I'm sad there's not a rat token involved. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Warm Welcome, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. It says, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Create a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token. This type of effect is usually kind of rough, since you spend some significant mana and don't add to the board, but this time around it actually does, albeit with a 1/1 citizen. But that matters. Not only does it add something to the board, but with both Citizen Tribal and Alliance being a thing in the format, there's extra value placed on something like this. So you end up getting the best creature in your top 5 cards and a 1/1 right away. Don't get me wrong, it still isn't amazing or anything, but I think it's a playable card that'll make it into a decent chunk of your decks. I'm giving it a C-. And our last green card is Workshop Warchief, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 5/3 Rhino Warrior at rare. It's got Trample. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life, and when it dies, you make a 4/4 green Rhino Warrior creature token, and it has Blitz for 4 generic and 2 green. So this is the new Thragtusk, and in most ways, it's just better than Thragtusk, which is kind of crazy. This more than gives you your mana's worth, whether you cast it normally or blitz it. Casting it normally is probably better most of the time, since it's such a pain to block or attack into for your opponent, since they know you're going to get a sizable creature token when the Warchief dies. Blitzing it can generate even more absurd advantage though, which is why they put it at 1 mana higher. You get 3 life, a 4/4, and a 5/3 Trampler Ball Lightning that draws you a card when it dies. So yeah, this is a bomb. It's, not the kind of bomb that has a huge game warping effect necessarily, but it just generates so much value, it's going to be difficult for your opponent to catch back up. I'm giving it an A. Alright, let's move now into colorless cards, beginning with colorless artifacts, and our first card is Arc Spitter, which for 1 generic is an artifact equipment at uncommon, and it has 1 generic. This creature deals 1 damage to target creature that's blocking it, and it can equip for 1 too. So this is a really interesting card. My first instinct when I first saw this card is it's probably not very good. It doesn't augment the creature it goes on, and it has sort of a situational effect. But the more I thought about this card, the more I thought about how good it is in terms of threat of activation. Like, your opponent is going to have a hard time blocking whatever you put this on. If you just equip this to something, which you can do very cheaply, you can also cast it very cheaply, and then equip it to something and you attack your opponent and you have a bunch of mana up, what are they going to do? I mean, if they don't have a way to interact, this can definitely create some situations where your creatures are just getting through. Or, your opponent's forced to block because they can't take the damage and you just get to blow up things that are blocking it. So basically, it's cheap to cast, cheap to equip, and its ability is also reasonably costed, so much so that it'll make people really think about whether they want to block. If you combine this with Death Touch, it gets especially nasty. The one thing to keep in mind is that it is almost entirely useless if you're behind. Everything I've said so far has been good, but this does stone nothing if you're behind. It's not going to help your board. It's not going to make things better for you in any way if you're in the mode where you need to be blocking. And that definitely matters. A card that's this one-dimensional definitely matters. But I think the idea of having one of these in a lot of my aggro decks in the format sounds fine. I'm giving it a C. And it is a weird card. I could see it, ending up as an F, and I could see it ending up as a B. It's a hard one to evaluate. We've never seen something quite like it, but I'm starting it as a C. Next up, it's Brass Knuckles, which for 4 generic is an uncommon artifact equipment. When you cast it, you copy it, which means you get a token copy of it. Equipped creature has double strike as long as 2 or more equipment are attached to it. Equip 1. So this is a really roundabout way to give one of your creatures double strike. You pay 4 and then 1 to equip the original one, and then another 1 to equip the copy. And that's not a great rate, even for double strike. And it gets better in situations where you can buff the creature, but because it doesn't buff the creature at all, there are going to be some creatures that just don't really benefit from this. Also, the card does stone nothing if you have it equipped to something that doesn't have another equipment on it, and your opponent can solve that problem pretty easily. We've seen several cards throughout the week that have modal effects that blow up artifacts and enchantments that'll be in the main deck. And there's not enough other good equipment in this format for there to be like an equipment deck. If there was, this would be a little better. I think this is probably a D, and it might be even worse than that. Next up, it's Cement Shoes, which for 1 generic is an uncommon artifact equipment. The equipped creature gets +3/+3 and has, at the beginning of your end step, tap this creature. Equipped creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step, and you can equip it for 2. So this is another pretty interesting piece of equipment. It's sort of like Enormous Energy Blade from the last set. That card ended up being terrible, unsurprisingly, but they did it a little more interestingly here. The casting cost and the equip cost are pretty nice for a +3/+3 boost, and at least you can take advantage of it immediately by attacking with the creature you put it on. but the fact that the creature gets locked down is pretty rough. Now, it's cheap enough, you can move it around so it goes onto a creature that you don't care about being locked down, like maybe one shut down by an aura, but that ends up being a lot of mana. You can also attack with something you know will result in a trade, so you don't have to worry about moving it. Basically, this isn't a bad mana sink to have around in the right situations, and it'll definitely make just about any creature into a much better attacker. But this is another piece of equipment that is useless if you're on defense. Your creature isn't going to be untapped with this boost, that also is a pretty big liability. But I think the efficiency of the card probably still is enough for it to be playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Chrome Cat, which for 3 generic is a 3/2 artifact creature cat at common. When it enters the battlefield, it scries 1. So this has mediocre stats with some tiny upside. It's probably something that makes the cut a decent chunk of the time, but it probably gets cut an equal amount and maybe a little more. It's definitely not a bad card in any way, but in this day and age where limited cards are getting better and better, just having some random card like this that has no real synergy with the rest of your deck and mediocre stats and a very small effect, that's looking worse and worse these days. So I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Getaway Car, which for 3 generic is a 4/3 artifact vehicle. At rare, it's got haste, and when it attacks or blocks, you return up to 1 target creature that crewed it this turn to its owner's hand, and it has crew 1. So sometimes you'll be able to get some value out of returning something to your hand, which is especially nice with into the battlefield creatures or decks that want to trigger Alliance a bunch. But there's also the pretty real downside that you can't crew this with a token. I mean, you can, and you sort of sacrifice a token to crew it, but you lose the token permanently. And the upside, while it's nice, isn't incredible. Like, if you don't have the synergies to get value out of returning things to your hand, this being a 3 mana 4/3 with haste and crew 1, it's nice, but it's not anything special. I think this is probably just a C. Next up, it's Gilded Pinions, which for 2 generic is a common artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you make a treasure token. Equipped creature has flying, and you can equip it for 2. So this gives you fixing and flying for a relatively fair cost. Typically, equipment that only grants flying isn't great because it's only very impressive on creatures that are already pretty good and not very impressive on smaller creatures. So that's always a downside on equipment like this. I think this is a C-. Next up, it's Halo Scarab, which for 2 generic is a 2/1 artifact creature insect at common. You can pay 2 and exile it from your graveyard to create a treasure token. This has mediocre stats, and it gives you some value out of the graveyard. That'll be nice whether you mill it or discard it or just have it die from being into play. 2 mana to make a treasure is obviously not a great rate, but it does give you the potential to have fixing in just about any deck. I think this is going to be pretty easily cut in a deck that's not really interested in the mana, and a lot of decks will just be able to get enough fixing that they don't need it, but it's alright. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Luxior, Giada's Gift, which for 1 generic is a legendary artifact equipment at Mythic Rare. The equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each counter on it. Equipped permanent isn't a planeswalker and is a creature in addition to its other types. Loyalty abilities can still be activated. You can equip it to a planeswalker for 1, and you can equip it to anything else for 3. This is a cool design, especially for constructed. It has some potential, but it doesn't look very good and limited. For one thing, your chances of having a planeswalker are limited. For another, you need to have at least a couple of counters on your creature for the equip cost of 3 to really feel like you're getting your value back. That is doable in the format, especially in green-white, where you have a bunch of +1/+1 counters and shield counters, but you're still looking at a card that will sometimes offer no boost at all, and that is a huge liability. I think this is a D+. Next up, it's Ominous Parcel, which for 1 generic is a common artifact. You can pay 2 and tap it and sack the parcel to search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And you can pay 5 and tap it and sacrifice it to do 4 damage to a creature. So this is a decent little modal artifact that can help you fix your mana, or it can be a removal spell. It's pretty bad at both of those things when you look at the total mana you end up spending for each, but the fact it can do both makes it a decent enough card. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Paragon of Modernity, which for 4 generic is a 2/2 artifact creature angel warrior at common. It has flying, and you can pay 3 generic, and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If exactly 3 colors of mana were spent to activate this ability, put a +1/+1 counter on it instead. This looks pretty solid. It starts out as a pretty inefficient creature with an expensive ability, but a lot of decks in this format are going to be 3 colors, so putting counters on this as a mana sink in the mid to late game seems pretty legitimate. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Quick Draw Dagger, which for 3 generic is a common artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you attach it to target creature you control. That creature gains first strike until end of turn. The equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has an equip cost of 1. So this is like a combat trick that offers +1/+1 and first strike for 3 mana, which is bad. But the bonus is that you get to have this stick behind and you have a decent equipment around that you can move from creature to creature for only 1 mana. Overall, that seems pretty solid to me, especially in aggressive decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Scuttling Butler, which for 3 generic is a 4/1 artifact creature constructed uncommon. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control 2 or more multicolored permanents, it gains double strike until end of turn. A 3 mana 4/1 is pretty bad, but the upside here is actually pretty impressive, as giving a 4/1 double strike is a force to be reckoned with. Your deck needs to be able to give this double strike a significant chunk of the time, of course, and the good news is that it looks like it can happen in a lot of decks in the format, though it's perhaps the easiest in green-white, or Cabaretti more broadly, because of citizen tokens, which are all 2 colors, so having 2 of those, or 1 of those and then another multicolored creature, probably more doable early than just having 2 multicolored creatures around. And most decks are going to have enough multicolored permanents that I don't really see you cutting this from any deck in the format. I mean, you'd have to end up in a really weird deck that doesn't have the 5 multicolored permanents you sort of expect to have. Overall, I think this is a C+. You could maybe give it a build around grade. Maybe in a green-white deck, it's like a B, but it looks pretty nice overall. Next up, it's Suspicious Bookcase, which for 2 generic is a 0/4 artifact creature wallet uncommon. It has Defender, and you can pay 3 and tap it to make a creature unblockable this turn. This is a reprint and a pretty uninteresting and weird one to include here. It wasn't particularly good last time we saw it, but it wasn't a complete disaster. It has okay defensive stats, and, you know, it can send things in unblocked late, but only for a rather expensive cost and the cost of tapping it down too. So, yeah, it's not great. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Unlicensed Hearse, which for 2 generic is an artifact vehicle at rare. You can tap it to exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards exiled with it, and it has crew 2. This looks pretty good to me. This format seems like it's going to have many well-stocked graveyards, and this simultaneously hates on them while also becoming absolutely massive as the game goes on, at which point the 2 mana and the cost of crewing it for 2 is going to be very reasonable. Now, the problem is there won't always be things to exile, even in this format, but it still feels like it's going to be pretty good, kind of like Lion Sash and Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, or maybe Scavenging Ooze. It's not as good as either of those since it's a vehicle, and those can be creatures, and then the Sash can even equip to things. But the trade-off is that it can exile stuff for no mana at all, and it doesn't care what kind of card gets exiled. It grows either way, and that is pretty sweet. It may not have a lot to do early, but once you play this in the mid to late game, it's just going to get larger and larger, and it may just be a big vanilla creature, but for the amount of mana you spend and how easy it is to crew, that's going to be a pretty impressive thing. I think this is a B+. Alright, now we're moving into lands. The only lands we have in this set are 3 cycles of lands. The first of these is like Botanical Plaza here. They all add 2 allied colors, in this case green and white. They enter the battlefield tapped, and you can pay 2 generic and those 2 allied colors to sacrifice the land to draw a card. So these are nice fixing, and being able to pitch them for a whole card in the late game is nice. It offers you some flood insurance and gives you something to do with all your mana. Like most dual lands, I think you should value this reasonably highly. They probably get a little worse if you're a really aggressive deck and you can't afford to have tap lands and stuff, but most decks can afford to have 1 or 2 of these without it being a big problem. I think these are a C+ collectively. The next cycle is like Broker's Hideout here. Each of the crime families has one of these. When they enter the battlefield, you sacrifice it, and when you do, you can search up a basic forest, in this case, plains or island. Those are the 3 Broker's colors, so all the others search up a land of one of the colors of that specific group. You put that onto the battlefield and then shuffle, and you gain 1 life. So this is some more pretty nice fixing, and that's not a huge surprise. 3 colors is what this format is really pushing. This is basically a more narrow Evolving Wilds, but one that also gains you life, and it doesn't have to tap either, though that's not going to come up much in Limited. You definitely will play these in a lot of your decks, as they'll be nice for your mana. They don't have the same late game upside of the dual land cycle, but it is nice that 1 life at least gives you some effect when you play these when you draw them late. I do rank them a little lower, I think, than that dual land cycle, but the overall grade's the same. I'm giving them a C+. And the last of these land cycles is the completion of the Tricycle land cycle. These are lands that have 3 basic land types of one of the crime families, and they can tap for those 3 colors, and they enter the battlefield tapped, and you can also cycle them for 3. So these all offer really good fixing too, and adding cycling to the mix is a big deal. It means if you're flooding late, this is a land you can just throw away for a new card, and that's pretty nice. I think these are a little better than the other 2 land cycles, but still about a C+. So, those are all the green and colorless cards in Streets of New Capenna. Tomorrow, I'll be bringing you an archetype guide where I go over the synergies for each of the format's archetypes. If you want to make sure you stay aware of when that video goes up, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to make sure you're all caught up on this set review, there should be a playlist on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.